The gold-plated receipt trembled between Maya's calloused fingers as 8 security cameras zeroed in on table 12. "Empty your pockets, now!" Damien Cross's voice cut through Romano's 5-star dining room like a blade, his $10,000 suit a stark contrast to her coffee-stained apron. Behind him, his board of directors watched with predatory anticipation. This public execution would be legendary. Maya's heart hammered as she reached into her pocket, feeling the crinkled paper that could either destroy her life or detonate his. The receipt she'd kept for 3 years. The one with his father's signature. The one proving Damien Cross wasn't supposed to exist in this boardroom at all. "You want proof?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the restaurant's sudden silence. "I'll give you proof that changes everything." The crystal chandeliers of Romano's cast shadows that danced across Maya Chen's worn sneakers as she balanced 3 plates of truffle risotto on her left arm, the 4th cradled carefully in her right hand. The dining room hummed with the kind of subdued wealth that spoke in whispers and paid in hundreds, where conversations about merger acquisitions mixed seamlessly with discussions of weekend yacht trips to the Hamptons. Maya had been serving tables here for 4 years. Long enough to recognize the subtle hierarchies that govern this world of power lunches and corporate handshakes, yet still an outsider looking in through bulletproof glass. Tonight felt different, though, charged with an electricity that made her skin prickle with unease. She wondered if anyone watching from their homes across the country could feel the same tension building. Calm meant where you're watching from if you can sense something's about to go terribly wrong. Table 12 commanded the restaurant's most prestigious corner, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of downtown Seattle's glittering skyline. Damien Cross sat at its head like a modern-day emperor, his platinum watch catching light with every gesture as he regaled his board of directors with stories of hostile takeovers and crushed competitors. Maya had served him exactly 7 times over the past 6 months, each encounter leaving her with a distinct impression that he viewed service staff as barely sentient furniture, useful when needed, invisible otherwise. His laugh carried across the restaurant with the confident ring of someone who had never been told no, never been denied anything his money couldn't buy. The men surrounding him nodded with the practiced synchronization of expensive yes men, their own watches and cufflinks forming a constellation of wealth that could fund small countries. Maya approached the table with the careful precision of someone who understood that a single mistake could cost her everything. Damien's eyes tracked her movement with predatory focus, his conversation never faltering as she set down each plate with practiced grace. The truffle risotto steamed in the restaurant's carefully controlled atmosphere, filling the space around table 12 with its earthy aroma that spoke of ingredients flown in from Italy that morning. She could feel the weight of multiple gazes tracking her every movement, as if each member of Damien's inner circle was cataloging her actions for future reference. The board members' wives, adorned in jewelry that cost more than Maya's annual salary, watched her with the detached interest of spectators at a gladiatorial match, their Botoxed faces arranged in expressions of polite indifference. "Excuse me." Damien's voice cut through the ambient noise like a scalpel, causing conversations at neighboring tables to falter and die. Maya turned back toward him, her trained smile already forming despite the ice that had suddenly flooded her veins. His expression had transformed from mild interest to something far more dangerous, the kind of look she'd seen sharks give their prey in nature documentaries. The board members shifted in their chairs with the collective awareness of predators who had caught an interesting scent, their earlier bonhomie replaced by an anticipatory stillness that made Maya's mouth go dry. Even the restaurant's background music seemed to fade, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for whatever came next. "My father's watch is missing." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread outward from table 12 to encompass the entire dining room. Damien's voice carried the kind of authority that turned statements into verdicts, accusations into convictions. Maya felt her carefully constructed world begin to tilt sideways as every eye in the restaurant fixed on her with laser focus, transforming her from invisible service worker to the center of a very public drama. The vintage Cartier watch he described was worth more than her family's house, a piece of horological art that had supposedly belonged to his late father Charles Cross, the legendary business titan whose shadow still loomed large over Seattle's corporate landscape. "I saw you near my jacket when you brought the wine." Damien's accusation carried across the restaurant with the finality of a judge's gavel, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. Maya's mind raced backward through the evening's events, trying to reconstruct every moment, every interaction, every breath she'd taken in proximity to table 12. The jacket in question hung on the back of his chair, a custom-tailored piece that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. And yes, she had brushed past it when delivering the wine selection he'd requested. Her hands trembled slightly as she processed the magnitude of what he was suggesting, the implications spreading through her consciousness like poison through her bloodstream. The restaurant manager, Mr. Romano himself, materialized beside their table with the practiced swiftness of someone who had built his reputation on handling delicate situations before they escalated into public relations disasters. His face had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained tan, the kind of pallor that spoke of mental calculations involving legal fees and insurance claims and the potential destruction of his establishment's sterling reputation. Maya watched as he immediately began apologizing to Damien, his words tumbling over each other in a cascade of deference and promised investigations, not once asking for her side of the story or even looking in her direction. The betrayal hit her harder than the accusation itself. After 4 years of loyal service, she had become expendable the moment her presence became inconvenient to someone with real power. "We'll call the police immediately, Mr. Cross." Romano's voice carried across the dining room, ensuring that every patron could hear his swift commitment to justice, or at least his version of it. Maya felt the walls of the restaurant closing in around her as she realized that her guilt had already been determined, her fate sealed by the simple mathematics of wealth versus poverty, influence versus invisibility. The other servers had begun backing away from table 12 as if her alleged criminality might be contagious, their faces reflecting mixtures of sympathy and relief that they weren't the ones standing in the spotlight of Damien Cross's displeasure. She could feel her career, her reputation, her entire future crumbling around her feet like ash from a burned building. But even as panic clawed at her throat, Maya's fingers found the folded paper in her apron pocket, the one she'd carried for 3 years like a talisman against exactly this kind of moment. The receipt felt warm against her fingertips, its edges worn soft from handling, its significance known only to her and one other person who could no longer speak for her. She thought of Charles Cross, Damien's father, and the last conversation they'd shared at this very table, his voice heavy with disappointment as he spoke about his son's character and the empire he was afraid to leave behind. As Damien continued his performance of righteous indignation, Maya realized that this wasn't random. This was targeted, calculated, designed to destroy her before she could become the threat he somehow knew she represented. The security cameras in Romano's had been installed with the kind of precision that suggested they'd captured more than their share of corporate espionage over the years, their unblinking lenses now focused on Maya with the intensity of a tribunal preparing for execution. Detective Rodriguez arrived within minutes of Romano's call, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had adjudicated disputes between the powerful and powerless countless times before. Maya stood frozen in the center of the dining room, aware that her every movement was being recorded, cataloged, analyzed for signs of guilt by an audience that had already reached its verdict. The other patrons had abandoned all pretense of eating, their expensive meals growing cold as they witnessed what would undoubtedly become the most entertaining story they'd share at cocktail parties for months to come. Damien Cross orchestrated the unfolding drama with the skill of a conductor leading a symphony of destruction, his voice never rising above conversational level even as he systematically dismantled Maya's life piece by piece. He gestured toward the security monitor with casual authority, pointing out timestamps that showed Maya approaching table 12 throughout the evening, each innocent interaction now reframed as potential evidence of criminal intent. The footage looked damning even to Maya herself. She could see how her movements might be interpreted as suspicious, how her proximity to his jacket could be construed as opportunity rather than the natural flow of professional service. The technology that was supposed to protect honest workers had become the instrument of her persecution, wielding objective reality as a weapon against someone who couldn't afford to fight back. "Check her pockets," Damien suggested, with the kind of helpful cooperation that spoke of someone accustomed to having his recommendations treated as commands. Detective Rodriguez nodded and approached Maya with professional courtesy that couldn't quite mask the resignation in his eyes. He'd clearly handled enough of these situations to know how they typically ended. Maya submitted to the search with as much dignity as she could maintain, acutely aware that every patron in the restaurant was watching her humiliation with the rapt attention usually reserved for reality television. Her hands shook as she emptied her apron pockets, producing only the tools of her trade: order pad, pens, breath mints, and the mysteriously significant receipt she kept folded small and close to her heart. The vintage Cartier watch, worth $250,000 according to Damien's increasingly detailed descriptions, was nowhere to be found on Maya's person or in her immediate vicinity. Detective Rodriguez conducted the search with thorough professionalism, checking her uniform, her small purse, even the service areas where she might have stashed stolen goods, but the timepiece remained elusive. Maya felt a momentary surge of vindication. Surely the absence of evidence would clear her name and expose Damien's accusations as the character assassination they so clearly were. But she underestimated both his preparation and his commitment to her destruction, as became evident when his assistant produced a folder containing witness statements from other diners who claimed to have observed her suspicious behavior throughout the evening. The witnesses were all members of Seattle's social elite, their names carrying the kind of weight that could influence judicial proceedings and public opinion with equal effectiveness. Maya recognized several faces from the society pages, their testimonials now describing her ordinary service routine in language that painted her as a cunning predator stalking wealthy prey. One woman claimed to have seen Maya lingering near table 12 during the wine service. Another swore she'd observed suspicious glances toward Damien's jacket, and a third insisted Maya had acted nervous and furtive throughout the evening. The statements read like a coordinated effort to establish criminal intent, their timing and specificity suggesting a level of premeditation that made Maya's stomach churn with the realization that she'd walked into an elaborate trap. Mr. Romano paced behind the hostess station like a caged animal, his restaurant's reputation hanging in the balance as the drama unfolded in his dining room with all the subtlety of a public execution. Maya watched him calculate the potential damage to his business, weighing her 4 years of dedicated service against the influence and legal resources of Damien Cross and his corporate empire. The mathematics of power politics played out across his face in real time, and Maya could see the exact moment when he decided that preserving his relationship with Cross Industries was worth sacrificing one expendable employee. His earlier warmth toward her had evaporated completely, replaced by the cold efficiency of someone cutting losses before they became catastrophic. "We'll need to search the service areas," Detective Rodriguez announced, his tone suggesting this was merely a formality before the inevitable arrest and prosecution. Maya followed him through the restaurant's back-of-house areas, past the kitchen where her co-workers avoided eye contact, and through the employee break room where her personal belongings were subjected to methodical examination. Each negative result seemed to frustrate rather than vindicate her, as if the absence of evidence was somehow evidence of her criminal sophistication rather than her innocence. She noticed Damien watching from the dining room doorway, his expression unreadable, but his posture radiating the satisfaction of someone whose plan was proceeding exactly as anticipated. As they made their way toward the employee restroom, Maya's mind began working through the evening's events with new clarity born of desperation. She remembered seeing something glinting on the floor near the ladies' room during her earlier break, a flash of gold that had caught her eye before disappearing when she looked directly at it. The memory felt important somehow, significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate. But when she mentioned it to Detective Rodriguez, his skepticism was palpable. A convenient discovery in an area she'd visited alone seemed less like vindication and more like the kind of amateur attempt at evidence planting that would only deepen her legal troubles. The suggestion that she might have hidden the watch there herself hung in the air between them like an accusation waiting to be formalized. Maya's co-workers continued their careful choreography of distance and avoidance, their earlier camaraderie replaced by the survival instinct that governed interactions between the powerful and powerless. She understood their position. Associating with someone accused of stealing from Damien Cross could poison their own employment prospects and financial security. The solidarity she'd counted on evaporated like morning mist, leaving her isolated in a room full of witnesses who were all too aware that their livelihoods depended on choosing the right side of this particular conflict. Even Maria, who had trained Maya 4 years ago and shared countless late-night conversations about their dreams and struggles, now avoided her gaze with the practiced blindness of someone who had learned when not to see. But as Detective Rodriguez concluded his fruitless search and prepared to escort Maya downtown for formal questioning, she felt the folded receipt in her pocket pulse with significance like a heartbeat against her palm. The paper Charles Cross had signed 3 years ago carried more weight than anyone in this room could possibly imagine. And Maya realized that Damien's elaborate performance was designed to prevent her from revealing its contents. This wasn't random criminal accusation. This was preemptive warfare against a threat he understood far better than she did. As handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Maya smiled for the first time that evening, knowing that her moment of vindication was approaching with the inevitability of dawn after the longest night. The handcuffs felt cold against Maya's wrists as Detective Rodriguez prepared to escort her from Romano's, but she made no move toward the door, her feet planted firmly on the polished marble floor like roots that had finally found purchase in fertile soil. The dining room had transformed into an impromptu theater where Seattle's elite watched the final act of what they assumed would be her professional and personal destruction, their faces reflecting the satisfied bloodlust of spectators at a Roman gladiatorial contest. Maya could feel the weight of their expectations pressing against her shoulders, their certainty that justice meant watching the powerless receive their inevitable punishment for daring to exist in proximity to real wealth. But the receipt in her pocket burned against her palm with the intensity of a weapon finally ready to be drawn, its significance about to detonate through this carefully choreographed scene of her humiliation. "Wait," Maya said, her voice cutting through the anticipatory silence with surprising authority. Detective Rodriguez paused in his escort toward the exit, professional curiosity overcoming his eagerness to process what seemed like an open and shut case. Maya reached into her apron pocket with deliberate slowness, her movements tracked by 8 security cameras and 40 pairs of eyes, all waiting for her to produce either stolen goods or some desperate attempt at exculpatory evidence. The paper she withdrew seemed impossibly small and insignificant compared to the magnitude of accusations swirling around her, its edges worn soft from 3 years of handling and its contents known only to her, and a dead man who had trusted her with more than anyone in this room could comprehend. "This is a receipt from Romano's," Maya announced, her voice growing stronger as she unfolded the document with ceremonial care. "Dated 3 years ago, a private dinner for Charles Cross." The name fell into the dining room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition that spread outward from table 12 to encompass every corner of the restaurant. Charles Cross had been a legend in Seattle's business community, a titan whose death had left a power vacuum that his son Damien had rushed to fill with ruthless efficiency. Maya watched Damien's face carefully as she spoke his father's name, noting the micro-expression of alarm that flickered across his features before being replaced by calculated indifference. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier confidence beginning to crack as they realized this evening's entertainment was about to become considerably more complex. The receipt bore Charles Cross's distinctive handwriting, his signature flowing across the bottom in the bold strokes of someone accustomed to signing documents that moved mountains and toppled governments. But it was the personal note scrawled in the margin that transformed this simple piece of paper into something approaching explosive ordnance. "For Maya, your integrity reminds me why I built this company. Keep fighting for what's right. CC." Maya had treasured these words for 3 years, carrying them like a talisman against the daily indignities of serving people who barely acknowledged her humanity. She'd never imagined they would become her salvation, evidence of a relationship that predated Damien's ascension to power and suggested knowledge that could threaten his entire empire. "My father never ate here," Damien interjected, his voice carrying forced casualness that didn't quite mask the tension bleeding through his carefully maintained composure. But Maya was ready for his denial, producing her phone with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to document everything in a world where her word meant nothing against theirs. The photos she'd saved told a different story. Images of Charles Cross sitting at table 12 on multiple occasions, his face animated in conversation with the young waitress who had somehow earned his respect and confidence. The digital timestamps corroborated the receipt's date, creating an irrefutable record of meetings that Damien claimed had never occurred. Each image seemed to physically diminish him, his authority eroding like sandcastles before an incoming tide. The receipt's significance extended far beyond simple proof of service, as Maya began to explain with growing confidence. Charles Cross had mentioned specific business discussions during their last meeting, conversations about succession planning that cast doubt on Damien's legitimacy as heir to the Cross Industries empire. The handwritten note referenced concerns about his son's business ethics, worries that had grown into active investigation of Damien's increasingly aggressive acquisition tactics. Maya had been a confidant rather than simply a server, someone Charles trusted with observations about the corporate world that his own family and board members were too compromised to provide. The revelation transformed every previous interaction between Maya and Table 12 into something approaching espionage, with implications that sent visible shockwaves through Damien's assembled supporters. Detective Rodriguez studied the receipt with the focused attention of someone whose understanding of the evening's events was undergoing radical revision. The document's authenticity was unquestionable. Charles Cross's handwriting was too distinctive to forge, and the restaurant's own records would corroborate the private dinners Maya described. More importantly, the receipt suggested pre-existing relationships and knowledge that recontextualized the theft accusations as something approaching witness intimidation. The detective's expression shifted from skeptical authority to genuine interest as he began to understand that this case involved considerably more than simple larceny. Maya watched him process the implications, noting the exact moment when he realized that arresting her might interfere with a much larger investigation. The board members who had earlier provided witness statements now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having potentially perjured themselves in service of covering up whatever Damien was so desperate to hide. Their faces reflected the dawning awareness that their testimonies might have been orchestrated rather than organic, their reputations now vulnerable to association with what was beginning to look like a criminal conspiracy rather than righteous prosecution. Maya could see them mentally calculating legal exposure and plausible deniability, their earlier solidarity with Damien evaporating as they realized he might have manipulated them into becoming accessories to whatever crimes the receipt implied. The dynamic at Table 12 shifted visibly as each member began protecting their own interests rather than supporting their host's agenda. Charles Cross's handwriting seemed to glow under the restaurant's crystal chandeliers, transforming from simple notation into something approaching sacred text that rewrote the evening's narrative with biblical finality. Maya had never fully understood the weight of responsibility Charles had placed on her shoulders during their final conversation. His references to keeping records and being ready when the time comes, making sense only now as she watched his son's carefully constructed world begin to crumble. The old man had been playing a longer game than anyone realized, using a young waitress as his insurance policy against the son he could no longer trust. Maya felt the full magnitude of that trust settling around her shoulders like a mantle of authority she'd never asked for but was finally ready to claim. Mr. Romano approached Table 12 with visible trepidation, his earlier eagerness to prosecute Maya replaced by the growing realization that his restaurant had become the setting for a drama considerably more complex than simple theft. The receipt in Maya's hands represented years of private meetings between one of Seattle's most powerful businessmen and a woman Romano had dismissed as disposable help, suggesting relationships and knowledge that could reshape his understanding of who wielded real power in his establishment. His apologies to Damien became more tentative, hedged with qualifications that reflected his dawning understanding that Maya might not be the liability he'd assumed. The balance of power in Romano's was shifting with tectonic force, and Maya stood at the epicenter of an earthquake that would reshape everyone's understanding of where they fit in Seattle's intricate hierarchy of influence. As the implications of Charles Cross's receipt continued to reverberate through the dining room, Maya felt something she'd never experienced in 4 years of service at Romano's. The attention of people who finally saw her as someone worth listening to, rather than someone to be managed and controlled. The transformation was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, but she drew strength from the memory of Charles Cross's final words to her about the importance of timing and courage. Her moment had arrived with the force of destiny, and she was finally ready to honor the trust a dying man had placed in her hands. The atmosphere in Romano's had undergone a seismic shift. The earlier predatory excitement of watching Maya's destruction now replaced by the electric tension of spectators realizing they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple theft investigation. Maya stood at the center of the dining room's attention with newfound authority, the receipt in her hand serving as both shield and sword as she began to reveal the true depth of her relationship with Charles Cross. Detective Rodriguez had quietly removed her handcuffs, his professional instincts now focused on understanding the larger picture that was emerging from what had initially appeared to be a straightforward larceny case. The board members at Table 12 shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier certainty replaced by growing awareness that they might have been manipulated into supporting something far more complex and dangerous than they'd realized. Maya's voice grew stronger as she described the evolution of her relationship with Charles Cross, from respectful server to trusted confidant over the course of 18 months of private dinners at Table 12. The old man had initially been drawn to her directness and intelligence, qualities that stood in stark contrast to the sycophantic agreement he received from his corporate associates and family members. Their conversations had gradually deepened from pleasant small talk to serious discussions about business ethics and corporate responsibility, with Charles finding in Maya a moral compass that his own world had somehow abandoned. She spoke of evenings when he'd lingered long after closing time, sharing stories about building Cross Industries from nothing while expressing growing concern about the direction his son was taking the company he'd spent his life creating. "He gave me his lawyer's contact information," Maya continued, producing a business card from her wallet with the careful precision of someone revealing evidence that could reshape kingdoms. The card belonged to Margaret Chen, senior partner at one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms and Charles Cross's personal attorney for over 2 decades. Maya had never used the contact information, uncertain about her role in whatever plans Charles had been making. But she'd kept the card as proof that their relationship extended far beyond the boundaries of server and customer. The business card's existence suggested formal arrangements that could have legal implications far beyond tonight's accusations, and Maya watched Damien's composure crack slightly as he processed what his father's trust in her might have produced in terms of documented agreements or recorded conversations. The receipt itself contained more secrets than Maya had initially revealed, including a series of numbers written in Charles's distinctive handwriting along the bottom margin. She'd assumed they were some kind of accounting notation, meaningless to anyone outside the financial world that Charles inhabited. But now she wondered if they might represent something more significant. The numbers were too precise and deliberately placed to be random, suggesting they might be codes or references that Charles expected her to understand or share with someone who could decode their meaning. Maya noticed Damien's eyes fixated on these numbers with an intensity that suggested recognition, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by something approaching alarm as he stared at his father's final written communication to the woman he'd tried to destroy. Detective Rodriguez requested permission to photograph the receipt and business card, his professional demeanor now reflecting genuine interest in pursuing whatever investigation these documents might justify. The transformation in his approach was visible to everyone in the dining room, particularly the board members who had provided witness statements that were beginning to look more like conspiracy than legitimate testimony. Maya could see them calculating their exposure and planning exit strategies, their earlier solidarity with Damien evaporating as they realized their reputations might be collateral damage in whatever war was erupting around Table 12. The detective's questions shifted from interrogation to interview, acknowledging Maya as a witness rather than a suspect for the first time since his arrival. Maya's phone contained additional evidence that transformed the evening's narrative from criminal accusation to corporate intrigue with documentary precision. The photos she'd saved showed Charles Cross at table 12 on 6 separate occasions over 18 months, his face animated in conversation with the young woman who had somehow earned his trust and confidence. But more significantly, several images captured him writing in a small notebook during their conversations, his pen moving across pages with the deliberate care of someone creating records for future reference. Maya explained that Charles had often taken notes during their discussions, particularly when she shared observations about employee morale or customer behavior that might inform his business decisions. The notebook had disappeared after his death, but Maya's photos proved its existence and suggested that Charles had been conducting some form of investigation that required careful documentation. The board members' discomfort became increasingly visible as Maya described Charles's growing concerns about Cross Industries' direction during his final months. He had spoken repeatedly about hostile acquisition tactics that violated his personal code of business ethics, expressing worry that his son's aggressive approach was destroying relationships and reputations that had taken decades to build. Charles had been particularly troubled by reports of employee intimidation and vendor manipulation, practices that contradicted everything he believed about sustainable business success. Maya's role had evolved into something approaching corporate intelligence gathering, as Charles used her observations from serving other business leaders to understand how Cross Industries was perceived within Seattle's professional community. He was planning to make changes, Maya revealed, her voice carrying across the now silent dining room with the authority of someone delivering a historical verdict. Charles Cross had confided his intention to restructure the company's leadership before his unexpected death, expressing doubts about Damien's fitness to inherit control of an empire built on principles he seemed to reject. The old man had spoken about the importance of integrity in leadership and his responsibility to ensure Cross Industries continued serving its employees and customers rather than simply generating profits for shareholders. Maya's conversations with him had helped crystallize his thinking about succession planning, providing outside perspective that his corporate advisors were too compromised to offer honestly. The revelation that Charles had been questioning Damien's succession sent visible shockwaves through the assembled board members, their faces reflecting awareness that they might have been supporting someone whose claim to leadership was less secure than they'd assumed. Maya watched them process the implications of Charles's documented concerns, noting how their body language shifted from defensive solidarity to individual self-preservation. The hierarchy that had seemed so stable minutes earlier was beginning to collapse under the weight of evidence that their leader might not have had his father's blessing or legal authority to command their loyalty. Each revelation from Maya's conversations with Charles chipped away at the foundation of Damien's power, exposing fault lines that had been hidden beneath carefully maintained facades. Mr. Romano approached Maya with an expression combining apology and growing respect, his earlier willingness to sacrifice her reputation now replaced by awareness that she might be the key to understanding forces that could reshape his restaurant's relationship with Seattle's business community. The receipt and photos she'd produced suggested that Romano's had been hosting something approaching shadow board meetings, with Charles Cross using private dinners to gather intelligence and plan corporate strategy away from his son's surveillance. The restaurant's unwitting role in this corporate drama elevated its significance beyond simple dining establishment to something approaching historical landmark, where decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions in revenue had been made over plates of truffle risotto and bottles of vintage wine. As Maya continued revealing the depth of her relationship with Charles Cross, she began to understand that the numbers on the receipt weren't random notations, but rather coordinates pointing toward evidence that could complete her father's unfinished investigation. The old man had been more strategic than she'd realized, using their conversations not just for emotional support, but as part of a larger plan to protect his company's integrity. Maya felt the weight of responsibility settling around her shoulders like armor, finally comprehending that Charles Cross had chosen her not despite her humble position, but because of it. She was the one person in his world who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or corrupted by proximity to power. The moment Maya revealed that the numbers on Charles Cross's receipt corresponded to a safety deposit box at First National Bank, The atmosphere in Romano's transformed from tense curiosity to something approaching battlefield awareness. Damien's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and what looked remarkably like fear as he processed the implications of his father's final strategic move. The board members shifted in their chairs like animals sensing predators, their earlier confidence in Damien's leadership beginning to evaporate as they realized they might have been following someone whose authority was built on foundations far less solid than they'd assumed. Maya felt power flowing into her voice with each revelation. The years of serving this table in invisible silence, transforming into a moment of reckoning that would reshape everyone's understanding of who held real control in Seattle's corporate hierarchy. The watch accusation was never about theft, Maya announced, her voice carrying across the dining room with new authority that commanded absolute attention from every patron and staff member present. She explained how Damien's elaborate performance had been designed to discredit her before she could act on whatever information Charles had entrusted to her care. A preemptive strike against a threat he understood far better than she had until this moment. The safety deposit box represented Charles Cross's insurance policy against his son's corruption, containing evidence that could expose years of illegal business practices and fraudulent decision-making that had enriched Damien personally while devastating the company his father had spent decades building. Maya's role as keeper of the access codes made her the most dangerous person in Damien's world, someone who possessed the keys to his professional and legal destruction. Detective Rodriguez's expression shifted from professional interest to active investigation as Maya described Charles's concerns about his son's business practices, particularly a pattern of fraudulent acquisitions that had stripped assets from smaller companies while leaving their employees without severance or healthcare coverage. The old man had documented these activities with forensic precision, gathering evidence that could support both civil lawsuits and criminal prosecution under federal business fraud statutes. Maya had been his unwitting accomplice in this investigation, her observations about other business leaders who dined at Romano's providing crucial intelligence about how Cross Industries' reputation was deteriorating within Seattle's professional community. Each conversation she'd shared with Charles had been another piece of evidence in a case he'd been building against his own son. The board members began to understand that their witness statements might have made them accessories to obstruction of justice rather than helpful observers of criminal activity. Their faces reflected growing panic as they realized that supporting Damien's false accusations could expose them to legal consequences far more serious than anything Maya had been facing. Several members began quietly distancing themselves from Table 12, their survival instincts overcoming their loyalty to someone whose leadership was beginning to look more like criminal conspiracy than legitimate business authority. Maya watched them calculate their exposure and plan defensive strategies, noting how quickly corporate solidarity dissolved when faced with potential prison sentences and destroyed reputation. Charles left me shares in Cross Industries, Maya revealed, producing legal documents from her purse that she'd been afraid to examine until this moment of crisis forced her to understand their significance. The inheritance was substantial enough to grant her voting rights in corporate decisions, making her a legitimate stakeholder in the company rather than simply a working-class observer of its operations. More importantly, Charles had structured the bequest to activate only upon his death, meaning Damien had been operating under false assumptions about his complete control over the family business for the past 3 years. Maya's emergence as a shareholder threatened not just his authority but his freedom, as her voting rights could force transparency measures that would expose the fraudulent activities he'd been concealing from investors and regulators. The revelation that Maya possessed legal standing in Cross Industries sent shockwaves through the assembled board members, their earlier dismissiveness now replaced by calculating awareness that they might need to court her favor rather than support her persecution. The transformation was immediate and transparent, their body language shifting from predatory anticipation to respectful attention as they processed the implications of her newfound status. Maya felt the intoxicating rush of watching people who had ignored her existence suddenly hang on her every word, their earlier certainty about her insignificance replaced by urgent need to understand her intentions and capabilities. The power dynamics that had seemed immutable moments earlier were completely reversing, with the supposed victim emerging as someone who could determine the fates of everyone at table 12. Mr. Romano's approach to the situation underwent radical revision as he understood that Maya wasn't just a server who had been falsely accused, but a legitimate businesswoman whose shares in Cross Industries made her one of his most influential customers. His earlier willingness to sacrifice her employment to preserve his relationship with Damien now looked like catastrophic judgment that could cost him one of Seattle's most important corporate accounts. The restaurant manager's apologies became increasingly elaborate as he realized that Maya's voting rights could influence Cross Industries' choice of venues for business entertaining, potentially affecting thousands of dollars in monthly revenue. Maya accepted his contrition with grace, while noting how quickly respect followed recognition of her economic power. The safety deposit box access codes hidden in Charles's receipt represented more than just numbers. They were coordinates pointing toward evidence that could topple Damien's entire empire and restore ethical leadership to one of Seattle's most influential corporations. Maya explained how Charles had spent months documenting his son's fraudulent activities, creating a comprehensive case file that included falsified acquisition documents, evidence of bribery involving city planning officials, and recorded conversations that proved Damien's deliberate violations of federal business regulations. The old man had been building toward prosecution that would have sent his son to federal prison for decades, stopped only by his unexpected death before he could deliver the evidence to appropriate authorities. Detective Rodriguez requested immediate access to the safety deposit box, his professional demeanor now reflecting understanding that this case involved federal crimes far beyond his local jurisdiction. The transformation of a simple theft investigation into potential white-collar prosecution required resources and expertise beyond what Romano's dining room could provide. But the evidence Maya possessed was compelling enough to justify immediate action. Maya watched Damien's face as the detective made preliminary contacts with federal investigators, noting how his earlier arrogance had been replaced by something approaching desperation as he realized that his father's final game was far more sophisticated than he'd anticipated. The board members who had provided false witness statements now faced the choice between maintaining their loyalty to Damien or cooperating with investigations that could expose the full extent of Cross Industries' criminal activities. Maya could see them weighing their options, calculating whether supporting someone facing potential federal prosecution was worth risking their own freedom and reputations. Their earlier solidarity was fragmenting along individual lines of self-interest, each member making personal decisions about their willingness to face legal consequences for someone else's crimes. The corporate unity that had seemed so formidable at the evening's beginning was dissolving into competing survival strategies. As Maya continued revealing the extent of Charles Cross's investigation into his son's criminal activities, she began to understand that tonight's confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Damien learned about her inheritance. The watch accusation was never about theft. It was about eliminating the one person who could activate Charles's carefully constructed legal trap and restore ethical leadership to Cross Industries. Maya felt the full weight of responsibility that Charles had placed on her shoulders, finally comprehending that she wasn't just inheriting stock shares, but the obligation to complete his work and ensure that justice prevailed over corruption. The receipt in her hands had been more than a memento. It was a roadmap toward redemption for a company that had lost its way under leadership that valued profit over principle. The evening's transformation from criminal accusation to corporate investigation was complete, with Maya standing at the center of a drama that would reshape Seattle's business community and determine the fate of thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on Cross Industries' ethical recovery. She had evolved from invisible server to visible force for justice, empowered by evidence that could topple corruption and restore integrity to institutions that had been compromised by greed and criminal ambition. The real theft hadn't been a missing watch. It had been Damien's theft of his father's legacy and his company's moral foundation. Crimes that Maya was finally positioned to expose and rectify. The mahogany table at Romano's had been transformed into an impromptu corporate battlefield where Seattle's business elite faced the reality that their careful hierarchies were crumbling in real time. Maya stood at one end with documents that could reshape the city's economic landscape spread before her like battle plans, while Damien Cross occupied the opposite position with his remaining allies clustering around him in increasingly desperate formation. The restaurant's elegant dining room had become an arena where decades of corruption were finally being exposed, with crystal chandeliers casting harsh light on financial documents that told stories of fraud, embezzlement, and systematic betrayal of fiduciary responsibilities. Detective Rodriguez coordinated with federal investigators via encrypted phone calls, his professional demeanor reflecting awareness that tonight's revelations could trigger prosecutions reaching into multiple state and federal jurisdictions. The safety deposit box documents that Maya produced painted a comprehensive picture of Damien's criminal activities over the past 3 years. Each falsified acquisition agreement and manipulated financial statement representing millions in stolen assets and hundreds of destroyed livelihoods. Charles Cross had documented his son's crimes with forensic precision, creating evidence trails that connected systematic fraud to specific bank accounts and shell companies designed to hide illegal profits. Maya read excerpts from her inheritance papers that detailed not just her stock ownership, but her father's expectations that she would use this evidence to restore Cross Industries to ethical business practices and compensate victims of Damien's criminal schemes. The transformation from serving tables to serving justice felt surreal, but Maya drew strength from Charles's written words about her integrity and moral courage. The board members who had earlier provided false testimony against Maya now found themselves facing potential prosecution as accessories to Damien's conspiracy. Their witness statements revealed as coordinated lies designed to discredit someone who posed an existential threat to their leader's criminal enterprise. Several members began actively distancing themselves from Table 12, their survival instincts overcoming whatever loyalty they'd felt to someone whose leadership had been built on systematic deception and illegal activity. Maya watched their corporate solidarity fragment along individual lines of self-preservation, noting how quickly powerful people abandoned each other when facing personal consequences for collective crimes. The hierarchy that had seemed so intimidating hours earlier was exposed as fundamentally fragile, held together by shared complicity rather than legitimate authority. Margaret Chen, Charles Cross's attorney, arrived at Romano's with the kind of authoritative presence that commanded immediate respect from law enforcement and corporate executives alike. Her reputation for handling complex business litigation preceded her into the dining room, where her professional assessment of Maya's documents confirmed their authenticity and legal significance. Maya felt vindicated as the lawyer explained how Charles had structured his bequest specifically to empower her with the tools necessary to expose his son's corruption and restore ethical leadership to Cross Industries. The old man's trust in her character had been based on careful observation of her integrity under pressure, qualities he'd found lacking in his own family and corporate associates. The revelation that Charles Cross had been wearing a recording device during several business meetings with his son added another dimension to the evidence available for prosecution. Maya produced digital files that captured Damien's voice acknowledging fraudulent activities and expressing satisfaction about destroying smaller companies through illegal acquisition tactics. The recordings were devastating in their clarity, featuring conversations where Damien bragged about bribing city officials and manipulating environmental regulations to reduce acquisition costs while maximizing personal profits. Federal investigators who had been monitoring the situation remotely requested immediate copies of these files, their significance extending beyond Cross Industries to potentially expose corruption in multiple government agencies. Mr. Romano's restaurant had become the epicenter of Seattle's most significant corporate scandal in decades, with media outlets beginning to gather outside as word spread through the city's business community about the unfolding investigation. The manager faced the surreal reality that his establishment was hosting the collapse of one of the region's most powerful business empires, with potential implications for hundreds of employees and millions in corporate assets. Maya graciously accepted his apologies while noting how dramatically his attitude had shifted once her legitimacy became undeniable, a transformation that reflected broader patterns in how society treated people based on perceived rather than actual power. The evening had become a masterclass in how quickly respect followed recognition of economic influence. The federal investigators who arrived to coordinate with Detective Rodriguez brought resources and expertise that transformed Romano's into something resembling a field office for white-collar crime prosecution. Maya cooperated fully with their requests for documentation, her role evolving from witness to key figure in what promised to be one of the region's most complex financial fraud cases. The investigators' professional assessment confirmed that Charles Cross's evidence could support multiple felony convictions under federal racketeering and securities fraud statutes, with potential sentences that could remove Damien from society for decades. Maya felt the weight of responsibility for ensuring that justice prevailed over corruption, understanding that her decisions would affect thousands of people whose livelihoods had been damaged by Cross Industries' criminal leadership. The board members' strategic retreat from supporting Damien accelerated as they understood the scope of potential legal consequences for maintaining loyalty to someone facing federal prosecution. Maya watched them calculate their individual exposure and begin making overtures about cooperation with investigations, their earlier solidarity replaced by competitive eagerness to minimize personal liability. The corporate unity that had seemed so formidable was revealed as fundamentally hollow, sustained by shared benefits rather than genuine loyalty or ethical commitment. Several members approached Maya directly to express their willingness to testify against Damien in exchange for consideration from prosecutors, their transformation from accusers to allies complete within hours. Damien's attempts at damage control became increasingly desperate as he realized that his carefully constructed empire was collapsing under the weight of his father's posthumous investigation. His threats and intimidation tactics, which had been effective against individual employees and smaller business partners, proved useless against federal investigators armed with documented evidence of systematic criminal activity. Maya noted how dramatically his demeanor had changed from confident authority to cornered predator, his earlier arrogance replaced by the feral desperation of someone facing the complete destruction of everything he'd built through illegal means. The transformation was both satisfying and sobering, demonstrating how quickly power built on corruption could crumble when exposed to legitimate scrutiny. The media attention surrounding the investigation began to attract other victims of Cross Industries' fraudulent business practices, with former employees and business partners coming forward to share their experiences of intimidation and financial manipulation. Maya's emergence as the catalyst for exposing these crimes made her a focal point for people seeking justice and compensation for damages they'd suffered under Damien's leadership. The personal testimonials added human dimension to the financial documents, illustrating how corporate crime affected real families and communities beyond the abstract numbers in bank accounts and financial statements. Maya felt honored to serve as a voice for people who had been silenced by fear and economic vulnerability. As the evening's investigation continued, Maya began to understand the full scope of responsibility that Charles Cross had entrusted to her through his carefully planned bequest. She wasn't just inheriting stock shares, but accepting the obligation to restore ethical leadership to Cross Industries and compensate victims of her predecessor's criminal activities. The receipt that had started as evidence of her relationship with Charles had become a roadmap toward corporate redemption, with Maya positioned to lead the company's transformation from criminal enterprise back to legitimate business organization. The magnitude of the challenge was daunting, but Maya drew strength from Charles's expressed confidence in her character and capabilities, qualities he'd observed during months of careful evaluation disguised as casual conversation over dinner. The federal agents who had commandeered Romano's back office worked with methodical efficiency to catalog the evidence Maya had preserved from Charles Cross's investigation, their professional assessment confirming what she'd suspected but never fully understood about the magnitude of his final project. Special Agent Williams, leading the white-collar crime task force, explained how Charles's documentation represented one of the most comprehensive internal investigations they'd encountered, with evidence trails connecting Cross Industries' fraudulent activities to a network of corruption that extended throughout Seattle's business and political establishment. Maya felt simultaneously vindicated and overwhelmed as she realized that Charles's trust in her had been based on his understanding that she possessed the moral courage necessary to expose crimes that more powerful people had chosen to ignore or enable through their silence. The digital files recovered from Charles's safety deposit box painted a devastating picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond simple business fraud to encompass bribery, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that could result in decades of federal imprisonment for everyone involved. Maya learned that her inheritance included not just voting shares, but detailed financial records showing how Damien had systematically looted Cross Industries' assets while manipulating stock prices to enrich himself and a small circle of co-conspirators. The evidence was so comprehensive that federal prosecutors were already discussing plea bargain strategies for board members willing to cooperate with investigations in exchange for reduced sentences, though Maya noted that several individuals seemed likely to face serious prison time regardless of their cooperation level. The revelation that Maya possessed advanced degrees in economics and business administration from the University of Washington shocked everyone who had dismissed her as merely a working-class server struggling to make ends meet. She had been pursuing graduate studies while working at Romano's, her academic credentials deliberately concealed to avoid the kind of attention that might interfere with her ability to observe Seattle's business community from an invisible position. Charles Cross had discovered her educational background through careful research, recognizing that her combination of theoretical knowledge and practical observation made her uniquely qualified to understand the implications of his son's criminal activities. The old man's choice of heir had been based on careful evaluation rather than sentimental impulse, selecting someone whose intelligence and integrity made her capable of restoring Cross Industries to ethical business practices. Agent Williams confirmed that Charles Cross had been cooperating with federal investigators for months before his death, his sudden passing interrupting an investigation that was approaching formal indictment phase. The old man's decision to document evidence through private channels had been motivated by concerns that premature disclosure might allow his son and co-conspirators to destroy crucial evidence or flee jurisdiction before arrests could be coordinated. Maya's role as evidence custodian had been carefully planned to ensure continuity of the investigation even if Charles didn't survive to see its conclusion, though he'd hoped to prepare her more thoroughly for the responsibilities she would inherit along with her stock ownership. The watch that had allegedly been stolen materialized from Damien's own jacket pocket during a search conducted by federal agents, planted there by his assistant, who had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The assistant's testimony revealed that the entire theft scenario had been orchestrated to discredit Maya before she could act on information contained in Charles's bequest, with witness statements coordinated in advance and security footage manipulated to support false accusations. The elaborate setup demonstrated the extent to which Damien had been willing to go to protect his criminal enterprise, including destroying innocent people who posed threats to his continued looting of his father's company. Maya's transformation from accused criminal to legitimate corporate leader occurred with the kind of dramatic intensity that seemed scripted for television. But the federal agents assured her that such reversals were common in white-collar crime investigations where perpetrators use their wealth and influence to intimidate witnesses. Her emergence as Charles Cross's chosen successor represented more than personal vindication. It offered hope for the hundreds of Cross Industries employees whose jobs had been threatened by Damien's systematic asset stripping and fraudulent business practices. The company's restoration under ethical leadership could preserve livelihoods and restore investor confidence in Seattle's business community, making Maya's success crucial for economic stability beyond her personal situation. The board members who had provided false testimony faced varying degrees of legal exposure depending on their knowledge of and participation in Damien's criminal activities. Agent Williams explained that several individuals appeared to have been manipulated into providing false statements without understanding their role in obstructing federal investigations, while others had been active participants in fraudulent schemes that netted them millions in illegal profits. Maya watched former antagonists become desperate supplicants seeking her recommendation for leniency, their transformation from accusers to pleaders complete within the span of a single evening that had revealed the true distribution of power and legitimacy in Seattle's corporate hierarchy. The media attention surrounding the investigation continued to intensify as other victims of Cross Industries' fraudulent practices came forward to share their experiences, with Maya emerging as a symbol of justice prevailing over corruption despite overwhelming odds. Reporters gathered outside Romano's to document the collapse of one of Seattle's most prominent business empires, their coverage focusing on the dramatic reversal of fortune that had transformed a working-class server into the agent of corporate accountability. Maya accepted interview requests selectively, using media attention to highlight the experiences of employees and business partners who had suffered under Damien's criminal leadership while being unable to seek justice through normal channels. Charles Cross's notebooks, recovered from the safety deposit box, contained detailed observations about Seattle's business community that would prove invaluable for federal investigators pursuing corruption charges against multiple prominent figures. Maya learned that her conversations with the old man had provided crucial intelligence about relationships and practices that he'd been investigating for potential prosecution. Her observations from serving other tables contributing to a comprehensive understanding of how corruption operated throughout the city's economic establishment. The realization that her work at Romano's had been contributing to a major federal investigation added new significance to every interaction she'd had with customers who had dismissed her as invisible help. The psychological profile that federal investigators had developed of Damien Cross painted him as a classic white-collar criminal who used inherited authority to mask systematic theft and fraud. His sense of entitlement preventing him from understanding that his actions constituted serious crimes rather than legitimate business tactics. Agent Williams explained that such individuals often escalated their criminal behavior when faced with exposure, making Damien's attack on Maya consistent with patterns they'd observed in other cases involving family business succession and internal whistleblowing. The old man's careful documentation of his son's character defects had been motivated by paternal responsibility as well as legal necessity, accepting that prosecution was the only way to prevent further damage to innocent people. Maya's acceptance of leadership responsibilities at Cross Industries represented more than corporate succession. It embodied the principle that ethical business practices could prevail over criminal corruption when ordinary people possessed the courage to speak truth to power. Her emergence from invisible service worker to visible corporate leader demonstrated how quickly perceived powerlessness could be transformed into actual authority when backed by evidence and moral courage. The receipt that had started as a memento of respect had become the foundation for corporate redemption, proving that Charles Cross's faith in her character had been justified by her willingness to risk everything for justice and accountability. As federal agents continued processing evidence that would reshape Seattle's business landscape for years to come, Maya began planning the restoration of Cross Industries to the ethical standards Charles had originally established when founding the company decades earlier. The magnitude of the challenge was daunting, but Maya drew strength from the knowledge that she possessed both the legal authority and moral mandate necessary to complete her predecessor's final project, ensuring that corporate power served community interests rather than individual greed. 6 months after the confrontation at Romano's that had exposed one of Seattle's largest corporate fraud schemes, Maya Chen stood in the executive boardroom of Cross Industries, addressing employees who had once faced unemployment due to Damien's systematic asset stripping, but now found their livelihood secured under her ethical leadership. The transformation of the company from criminal enterprise to legitimate business organization had required months of intensive work with federal regulators, financial auditors, and business ethics consultants. But Maya had approached each challenge with the same determination that had sustained her through 4 years of serving tables while pursuing advanced degrees. The receipt that Charles Cross had signed 3 years earlier now hung framed in her office, not as a trophy of personal victory, but as a reminder of the responsibility she carried to honor his trust and maintain the integrity he had valued above profit. The boardroom where Maya now held her weekly staff meetings bore little resemblance to the corporate battlefield where Damien had orchestrated his schemes of fraud and intimidation. She had restructured the company's leadership to prioritize transparency and accountability, implementing oversight mechanisms that would prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had flourished under her predecessor's regime. The former board members who had provided false testimony were serving various prison sentences, their cooperation with federal investigators having earned them reduced terms but not immunity from consequences for their roles in enabling Damien's criminal activities. Maya had replaced them with business leaders whose reputations for ethical practices and community involvement aligned with Charles Cross's original vision for corporate responsibility. Romano's restaurant had become Maya's informal headquarters for business entertaining, where she conducted meetings with the same grace and attention to detail that had characterized her service as a waitress. Mr. Romano had transformed the establishment into something approaching a shrine to corporate redemption, with Table 12 now reserved for Maya's use and featuring a small plaque commemorating the evening when justice had prevailed over corruption. The restaurant's association with the Cross Industries investigation had elevated its reputation beyond simple dining establishment to symbol of how ordinary spaces could become stages for extraordinary transformations when truth confronted power. Maya enjoyed the irony of conducting business from the same table where she had once been accused of theft, her evolution from servant to served representing broader themes about how quickly circumstances could change when backed by evidence and moral courage. The federal investigation that Maya's evidence had triggered continued to reverberate through Seattle's business community, with dozens of prosecutions resulting from connections exposed through Charles Cross's comprehensive documentation of corruption networks. Agent Williams had commended Maya's cooperation and courage during testimony that helped secure convictions for fraud, bribery, and racketeering charges that would remove criminal influences from the region's economic establishment for decades. Maya felt honored to serve as a witness for justice, while recognizing that her role extended beyond simple testimony to active leadership in restoring ethical standards to business practices that affected thousands of employees and their families. Damien Cross's trial had concluded with convictions on multiple federal charges that resulted in a 30-year prison sentence, ensuring he would never again threaten the company his father had built or the employees whose livelihoods he had endangered through his criminal schemes. Maya felt no satisfaction in his punishment, viewing it instead as necessary accountability for crimes that had damaged innocent people throughout Seattle's business community. The trial had provided closure for victims of Cross Industries' fraudulent practices while establishing legal precedents that would deter similar corruption in other corporate environments. Maya's testimony about Charles's investigation and her inheritance had been crucial in establishing the timeline and motivation for the elder Cross's final efforts to expose his son's criminal activities. The mentorship program Maya established for working-class students pursuing business education had become one of Cross Industries' most successful community outreach initiatives, providing scholarships and internships for young people who shared her background of academic ambition constrained by economic necessity. Maya drew from her own experience serving tables while completing graduate studies to understand the challenges faced by students who lacked family wealth but possessed intellectual capability and moral integrity. The program's success demonstrated how corporate resources could be deployed to expand opportunity rather than simply generate profits, embodying Charles Cross's belief that business leadership carried obligations to serve community interests beyond shareholder returns. Maya's decision to continue occasionally serving tables at Romano's on weekends had initially puzzled Seattle's business establishment, but she maintained the practice as a reminder of where she'd come from and the importance of staying connected to working people whose experiences informed her corporate decision-making. The customers she served now included many of the same business leaders who had once ignored her existence, their attitudes transformed by recognition of her authority, but also by growing awareness that ethical leadership required understanding perspectives from throughout economic hierarchies. Maya enjoyed the conversations that developed when powerful people realized they were being served by someone whose intelligence and influence exceeded their own. Educational experiences that contributed to broader cultural shifts toward respecting working people, rather than simply exploiting their labor. The receipt that had started as evidence of Charles Cross's respect had evolved into a symbol of how seemingly small interactions could carry profound significance when viewed through the lens of moral courage and strategic thinking. Maya had commissioned a larger version of the framed document for Cross Industries' main lobby, where employees and visitors could read Charles's handwritten words about integrity and fighting for what's right. The display served as both inspiration for ethical behavior and warning against corruption, reminding everyone who entered the building that legitimate authority derived from character rather than wealth or family connections. Cross Industries' financial recovery under Maya's leadership had exceeded all expectations, with employee morale and productivity reaching levels not seen since Charles's original leadership decades earlier. The company's reputation for ethical practices had attracted new clients and investment opportunities that more than compensated for revenue lost when Maya terminated contracts with organizations involved in corrupt activities. Maya's approach to business development prioritized sustainable relationships over quick profits, building the kind of institutional stability that Charles had originally envisioned when founding the company. The transformation demonstrated how quickly organizational culture could change when leadership genuinely committed to ethical principles rather than simply paying them lip service. The broader impact of Maya's emergence as a corporate leader extended throughout Seattle's business community, where her success had inspired other working-class individuals to pursue leadership positions they might previously have considered beyond their reach. Her story had become a case study in business schools throughout the region, illustrating how moral courage and intellectual capability could overcome economic disadvantage when supported by evidence and community allies. Maya regularly spoke at universities and professional organizations about the importance of integrity in business leadership, sharing lessons learned from both her service experience and her transition to corporate responsibility. As Maya concluded another successful quarter and prepared for Cross Industries' continued growth under ethical leadership principles, she reflected on Charles Cross's final gift. Not just stock ownership or even evidence of corruption, but confidence that ordinary people possess the capability to transform powerful institutions when armed with truth and supported by community. The receipt in her office continued to remind her that respect earned through character was more valuable than authority derived from wealth or inheritance. A lesson that would guide her decisions as long as she remained responsible for honoring Charles's trust and serving the employees who depended on Cross Industries for their livelihoods. The transformation from accused criminal to corporate leader had required Maya to develop skills and perspectives she'd never imagined needing. But the foundation of moral courage and intellectual integrity that Charles had recognized in a young waitress had proven sufficient to meet every challenge that emerged along the path toward justice and accountability. Romano's Table 12 would always represent the moment when truth confronted power and emerged victorious, proving that, in America, character and evidence could still triumph over corruption and influence when ordinary people possessed the courage to stand up for what was right. The end. Where are you watching this story unfold from? Comment below and let us know if you believe that ordinary people can still defeat powerful corruption when they have evidence and courage on their side. Maya's transformation from invisible waitress to corporate CEO proves that integrity and intelligence matter more than wealth and connections, but only when we're brave enough to speak truth to power.